So welcome back to weekly unit number 7, and this is part 2 of 3. And you just finished watching a video on stigma and discrimination. And now we're going to move into outcomes related to labeling, stigma, and discrimination of the mentally ill. And that's primarily a discussion around the consumer movement. And the consumer movement really was born as a result of the way mentally ill people were treated as a result of labeling, stigma, and discrimination. And so one of the most major forms of activity that has occurred against the mentally ill that has caused the greatest amount of outcry and continues to cause outcry today is this concept of forced treatment. And whether that was warehousing in asylums, locking family members in the basement of the house, or whether it is a 5150 or implementation of Laura's Law, that these coercive forms of treatment are seen as something that is involuntary. And because they're involuntary, that this treads on the rights of individuals with mental illness, specifically related to the concepts of self-determination and choice. And when we think about the treatment of mentally ill over and the lack of choice and self-determination related to that treatment, we begin to see not only the formation of a consumer movement, but actually the concept of social justice in action. Now, during your training and during your participation in school for your MSW program, you've been exposed to community organizing and social justice concepts in other classes. And in this regard, we want to look at how systems are affected by policy changes. And some of the greatest policy changes to occur in mental health systems were the direct result of the customers of that system rising up against the system, demanding specific changes. And not just changes in self-determination and choice, but the participation of the individual receiving those services, directly participating in decisions related to those services. And when you really think about the treatment of the mentally ill over the centuries, it's really technically just a recent phenomenon that the patient directly participates in the treatment and choices around their treatment. And so we really are witnessing social justice in action. And so when we think about all of the things that we've talked about during this semester, we've been identifying a mental health system within an administrative structure that is influenced by politics. And so the consumers of the services that we provide in reaction to treatment forms that were really rooted in stigma and discrimination and added to the stigma and discrimination of those being treated, that uprising unto itself is a political action. Social justice unfolding really is something that occurs ultimately in the political arena, because the decision makers who establish the policy that ultimately influence the system, those decision makers operate within a political environment, as we've learned earlier in the semester. So really, the consumer movement was all about political change. So what is the historical perspective that makes up all of the events that led to this political change in the emergence of the consumer movement? And, just looking at the history of mental health treatment over the century in a very basic way, right from the get-go, the opportunity for an individual to be able to refuse their treatment and to participate directly in any decisions related to their treatment really became a foreign concept right from the get-go. And one of the things that was in the Scheid reading is that, besides things such as some of the early treatment forms being, family members being able to lock family members legally within the home in order to control them, to some of the most earliest commitments directly resulting in husbands committing their wives basically to lifelong locked away warehousing of the mentally ill, even though these individuals weren't mentally ill themselves. It was just simply a way to deal with the relationship of marriage at the time. And from that, we begin to see the emergence of asylums. And it's really, the image of what occurs in an asylum that really has become this age-old icon related to the history of mental health and just how impersonal, inhumane those approaches were, that we were just really locking people away because we were unable to handle them within society, within our communities, within our families. And it was acceptable at that time to send them away. And then, as you know, as that history unfolded and those approaches were exposed to the public, it began to move the public consciousness to better recognize and understand what was occurring in the mental health arena. And so that exposure of the inside of asylums helped jumpstart the consumer movement, and some of its earliest foundations can be tied back to that particular era. And then there was also this emergence, not too distant from that, of the concept of civil rights, and a recognition that individuals are entitled to certain basic inalienable rights, that folks become motivated around that, and that becomes the basis for a movement that ultimately results in some form of public change. And all of that we just covered actually goes beyond the 1800s, but because this is not a history class and because a lot of this you already know, we're going to just come right up to more recent history. And it's in the 1980s, that we begin to see this idea of Reformation, or the reformist era, in that there's this transition of public opinion and perceptions related to the delivery of mental health services that begins to shift from one that was ultimately, anti-psychiatry to one that's more based on consumerism, in that the consumer plays a significant role within that mental health system. And it's also in the 80s that we actually, for the first time ever, see an organized conference for consumers to attend to talk about mental health treatment and methods and systems and ways by which they can influence those systems. And then most specifically, probably the greatest single act that changed mental health systems forever, from ones that were really inhumane and perpetuated stigma and discrimination, to one that focused on patients and become patient-centered, is the federal government mandates the State Comprehensive Mental Health Plan Act of 1986, which delineates that mental health plans within each of the states have to recognize the involvement of consumers directly in decisions related to those mental health plans, and that states have to recognize, entertain, and to the extent feasible, incorporate consumer ideas and initiatives into those plans. And so this really becomes the birthplace of this shift to the idea that consumers are a voice to be heard at the table when operating and administering a mental health system. And then getting even a little bit closer to more recent history, it's in the 1990s that there's this whole new thing that changes in the mental health system, and that is in how it's managed. Most mostly by a fiscal perspective. And this is an issue that we've already discussed this semester, but it's this whole transition to managed care, and this idea of imposing a system of cost containment, quality measures, and access control to mental health, aka managed care. And managed care is actually the introduction of profit-based mental health providers into the system, where and we know now in hindsight that the early forms of managed care really fell far short of what the expectations were around cost containment, access control, and quality assurance, because ultimately what we really had was access control related to cost containment and hardly anything that had anything to do with quality. And this whole idea of controlling access in order to limit costs and then other cost containment methods had a direct impact on consumers being able to make their own choices related to their care. So managed care actually becomes this new challenge again in the 1990s as related to consumerism because of the negative impact that it had on self-determination and choice. And so in the late 90s, now there's a backlash, a backlash against managed care for these very fundamental ideas of, denied services and folks actually being injured as a result of that. And so that backlash manifests itself in 1999 in what's commonly called the Olmstead decision, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But this is, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that actually legislates to the entire country, both federal, state, and local level, that unnecessary institutionalization diminishes the quality of life, and that states have to promote services that integrate the mentally ill back into the community so they can reside in the communities from which they come. And so this U.S. Supreme Court decision becomes a pivotal point again in essentially manifesting some of the basic social justice demands from the early days of the consumer movement. And then the most recent federal action that has had a tremendous impact on mental health systems throughout the country, but most specifically on California because of the influence that it had on the development of Prop 63 and the Mental Health Services Act, that fundamental action was the President's New Freedom Commission on Mental Health. This is actually George W. Bush's one of his legacies that he leaves to the industry that we find ourselves working in today. And this was in 2003 that they released a fundamental set of guiding principles related to mental health services delivery throughout the country. And this commission was made up of several mental health professionals, primarily the state director of mental health from each of the states, and several federal folks, and a number of other well-known professionals at the time. And this group comes together and comes up with these basic tenets that become the foundation for major systems transformation in mental health, leading to some of the greatest impacts of change ever in the history of mental health. And the main focus of the New Freedom Commission's principles really were that services needed to be consumer-centered, and this enforcement of the recovery model. And so this becomes the foundation or the roots or the birthplace of the mental health system transitioning to models based in wellness and recovery. And so, when you really think about it, it is amazing that some of the most transformative policy decisions made that have impacted the mental health system come from this commission, and came from a concern that George W. Bush had, a personal concern that he had witnessed related to the delivery of mental health systems. And so here you have the highest community leader, political leader in the country, moving the system as the ultimate system administrator from one type of policy to another, and using his authority to do that. Ultimately, what comes out of the commission are guiding principles and not necessarily the imposition of federal law on the states, because this wasn't a legislative act that occurred through either house of the Congress. This was not a judicial decision that occurred through the U.S. Supreme Court. This was an executive order imposed by the president based on the results of this commission. And so as a result, they really become guiding principles and not requirements that are rooted in a the strength of the law. That's not actually what occurred here. But nonetheless, these principles that came out of the commission have single-handedly had some of the most dramatic impacts on the transformation of the mental health system. So even with all of that in that short history, in seeing how we've moved from these basic ideas of labeling stigma and discrimination becoming the foundation for inducing political change by forcing the very people who had stigma imposed upon them and discriminated against standing up, just as we saw in the era of civil rights, standing up for what they believed to be an improper treatment of themselves and taking action as a population impacted, and taking that action to the decision makers and thus forever changing the system. And even with all of that occurring, we still have so far to go. Because remember, when you think about, you go back to some of the basic things that occurred in the mental health system that helped become the impetus for creating the consumer movement and giving the consumer movement energy, is this whole idea about forced treatment. The whole idea about how forced treatment it violates the right to self-determination and patient choice. And so, even with all of that happening, a new focus on recovery and wellness, and even with the Mental Health Services Act, 39 states still have forced medication compliance, assisted outpatient treatment, and outpatient commitment laws. And 42 states have actually increased their commitment criteria and have reverted to unpopular treatments such as electroshock therapy and surgery, and medication use is on the rise. So even with all of these changes happening, there is still data and evidence that demonstrates the very basic thing that caused the consumer movement to happen is still occurring today. And so now next you're going to just watch a video from an instructor who has taken a very creative approach to talking about the consumer movement, and it adds a whole number of other elements that have helped lead to the creation of the consumer movement. And anyway, it's just a creative way of looking at why the consumer movement came to be. And so you'll switch over to that video now, and then upon the completion of that video, you'll come back for part 3, which is the final part of this lecture.